So today what we're going to do is we're going to try to understand the criteria that was used for the arrangement of the order of the books in the English Bible, particularly today. Then we're going to look at the order in the Hebrew Bible next time, but we're going to look at it differently when we look at the Hebrew, because it's already arranged, and we're going to start seeing the importance of that arrangement. And then when we finish with the Hebrew arrangement, we're going to come back to the English arrangement to discover why the English arrangement is so very important and what we can learn from it. So what I'm trying to tell you, so if you take a handout number 6 and have it there on your lap, you'll notice that the English Bible is on the left and the Hebrew Bible is on the right. But just above each column, it says the English criteria and the Hebrew criteria. Right? And we're going to talk about those this morning. Now, just as a reminder, we don't know for certain when the English order came about. All we know from the manuscripts that have been discovered is that by the early 4th century, so somewhere in the 300s, copies of the Septuagint were in the English arrangement. We also know that Josephus listed the order of the Old Testament in one of his letters in the same basic order as the English order. So that would be around 60, 70 AD. So we don't know if the Septuagint was originally changed the order or whether it actually translated it in the Hebrew order. We don't know that. There's absolutely no manuscript evidence at all. So what we do know is that somewhere between 250 BC and 100 AD is that the original Hebrew order was changed. And what I'm saying to you today is that both these arrangements are important. There are some that would say, well, only the Hebrew arrangement is ordained by God and is part of the canon. Well, I don't agree with that. I think that God in His wisdom brought us the English order because as Westerners particularly, we need to see the Bible chronologically in order to understand certain things. And so there is important lessons to learn from both orders. But we're unfamiliar with the Hebrew order, so that's why we're introducing it in this course. Now today's lesson is going to be hopefully short, but it's also going to seem like, hey, we're going back to kindergarten here. We're in milk theology rather than meat theology, and that's okay. Because whenever you have a dinner of meat, you should always have something to drink, whether it's milk or anything else as well. So this is just the milk portion of our roast beef dinner, if I can put it that way. All right? So now, we also don't know for certain how or what criteria was used for changing the Hebrew order to what is now the Greek and English order. But we can look at it and we can logically deduce that there were 3 criteria that were in fact used. And so for the Greek mindset, to understand the order that it was changed to, we're going to look at genre, chronology, and authorship. Now we're going to not look at them individually. We're going to go through the whole change to see how in fact the thought press came about. Now genre is simply the type of literature. So it asks questions like, is this poetry? Is it narrative? Is it history? Is it prophecy? These are the kinds of questions you're asking. And you're trying to get a broad, general description of what type of literature the book is. And then it's going to group them by that type. And then within those groups, they're going to use chronology, so they want to make sure that they are in historical order of the events. And some of the books they're going to look at and they say, hey, I'm not really sure where this goes, but it was written by somebody else, so we're going to keep the authorship together. So those are the kinds of things that we assume were used to create this English order. So they obviously used the Hebrew arrangement to begin with. So what I want you to do is by having this chart number 6 in front of you, then we're going to follow the Hebrew order as though we're looking at it And that's the only order that exists. And we're going to say, hey, I need to put this in kind of a chronological and a genre. I need to understand it better. So I'm going to change the order. And we're going to use this chronology, genre chronology, and authorship to help us do the change. So if we look at the books of the law there, the Hebrew order, the Hebrew arrangement, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, what genre are they? What do you think?
History.
What's that, Joe?
History?
History. Yes, it's definitely. It starts with the creation of the world, goes to the flood. It introduces us to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, then the being in Egypt, and the Exodus with Moses, and the giving of the law, the wanderings, and then the repeat of the law, another standing there at the edge of the Jordan River, getting ready to enter the land. So it's definitely history. But it's also more than history, because Genesis, Exodus, and Numbers are definitely historical by themselves. But half of Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy are all instructional. So it's more instruction than it is, in fact, history. Right? So what we need to do is we need to kind of keep these by themselves, kind of keep them together, because nobody messes with the Holy Grail of Jewish literature known as the law. So whoever put this together had an understanding that these books by themselves are very important. But in their Greek mind, the law doesn't mean anything to them. So what they did was they said, well, these are 5 books, and therefore we're going to call them the Pentateuch, because the word Pentateuch means 5. So in their mind, they're saying, okay, we recognize that these 5 books go together, or we're just going to call them the Book of 5 to help us to understand that they need to be different from all the others. But they're still historical, and they're still historical narrative. So we're going to put them over in this particular spot. That brings us then to the next list, which are the prophets. And the prophets have 2 groups. 4 that are called the former prophets, and the next 4 are the latter prophets. So let's look at the former prophets. What is the genre of Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings? Definitely history, isn't it? I mean, it's all history. Nothing really more. It's just historical events and stories, one after another, all the way through. Beginning with the conquest of the land in Joshua, all the way to Kings, where they're kicked out of the land. So it's the conquest, the reign of the kings, the judges of the kings, and then being taken out of the land. So we're going to definitely move them over the same genre as the first 5 books, but to keep the first 5 books different, we're going to call these the books of history. But they are over there. Of course, when you look at Deuteronomy, the book of Deuteronomy ends with Moses saying, hey, I'm going to make Joshua the new leader. And chapter 1 of Joshua, Joshua says, hey, Moses is now dead. I'm going to be the new leader. So it connects Deuteronomy and Joshua in its historical aspect. So definitely they fall in together in the same chronological order. Of course, the things that happened in Joshua happened before Judges, and the things that happened in Judges happened before Saul and David and Solomon and the divided kingdom in the other books. So, are they in chronological order? Yeah, they are. They're basically in chronological order. So we have our first major division, and which is history, and it has 2 subgroups, which is the Pentateuch and history. In fact, we could say that the first 5 books are Pentateuch history, and the next books are just regular history, if you can. So Genesis to Kings covers from about 4000 BC, the creation event, to about 586 BC, when Jerusalem was destroyed. So definitely chronological. Now, of course, when we translate from the Hebrew to the Greek, remember what we talked about, the problem with the scrolls, the scroll length? It was too long when you put it into the Greek language, so they had to split the scrolls. So when it comes into the English side, we have 1st and 2nd Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. All right, that brings us now to the latter prophets. So the latter prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the book of 12. So what do we do with Isaiah? What genre is Isaiah? What do you think?
Prophetic.
Prophetic, and how? Why do you say that?
Lots of prophecy.
Actually, there's, in terms of future events, it's very little. And Isaiah is really, when he talks about future events, he's talking about the judgment of God that's coming around the corner. It doesn't go very far. Okay, but all of these guys, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, these guys are acting like God's lawyers. And they're saying, hey, look, you guys have been in this land, and you haven't obeyed a single thing that Moses told you to do. And because of that, God said if you obeyed, I would bless you. But because you haven't obeyed, He's going to curse you and remove you from the land. So this is the things that you did against God. And here's why He's going to remove you from the land. And guess what? It's coming really, really soon. And that's what these guys are doing. So in that sense, they're prophetic. Right? And in fact, the way we really know that Isaiah is a prophet, because every single reference to Isaiah in the book of Kings, and even when he refers to himself in his own book, he always says Isaiah the prophet. That's kind of cool, eh? You don't really have to guess, because it tells us that Isaiah is the prophet. And of course, then we understand the style of the book. We see that it is the oracle of God's judgment against the children. And that's what Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel are all like. So these guys all go together. So what we're going to do then is we're going to stick them over here in this corner, and we're going to call this the genre of the prophets. Now we're going to come back to them in a moment as well. So that brings us now to the third section, which is called the writings. Right? And the writings, again, has two groups. It begins Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ruth, Song of Songs, and Ecclesiastes. Now, if you look at those first 6 books in the writings, it always reminds me of Sesame Street, where they put up the pictures of a whole bunch of different things, and they say which one of these things belongs with the others, or is not like the others, rather. Okay? So when you look at that list from Psalms to Ecclesiastes, which one of these books does not belong with the others? Ruth. Why? Well, number one, Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Song of Songs, they're all in poems, but Ruth is a narrative. And Ruth is also a historical narrative. So what are we going to do with Ruth then? We're going to stick her we're going to stick her over where?
History.
Into the history section. Okay, but where in the history section? How do we know where it fits in? Well, look, if you look at Ruth chapter 1, verse 1, it begins by saying, in the days that the judges ruled. So we know that the events happened during the time of the judges. Well, is it the early part or the latter part? Well, we know from her story and from hints within the story, and even the genealogy of David at the end, that it is towards the latter part of the judges, and just before the birth of Samuel, who was also one of the judges. So, where are we going to stick it? Right there in that hole between Judges and Samuel. Right? So now we have another history book. And it follows, it's the same genre, and it follows chronologically. Right? All right, everybody with me? Good. This is really simple stuff, and I know you know this. Right? But we're going through the thought process of these original guys. So now we have Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. So what are all of these books? How would you classify them? What type of literature are these books that are left? Poetry. They're definitely poetry. All right, so we can keep them together and classify them this way. So now what order are we going to put them in? So we have to ask the question, are they in chronological order? And what would your answer be?
Nope.
Nope, they're not. Why is that, Job?
Because Job is ancient.
Yeah, okay, the story of Job is really old. Now, when the story of Job was written, was probably during the reign of David or Solomon. That's probably when it was written. But when it actually happened, it probably happened. You know, most commentaries will tell you that it happened between Genesis 11 and 12. So after Noah, but before Abraham. But there's evidence in the book that really suggests that he was during the time of either Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob, somewhere with the patriarchs. So in terms of age, Job definitely comes first. So we need to change the order here and put Job before the Psalms. Who wrote most of the Psalms? David. And so Job comes before David in terms of order. And so that leaves us with Proverbs, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. Right? Who wrote those? Solomon. It's supposed that Solomon wrote all of them. We don't have evidence, internal evidence, to suggest that he wrote Song of Songs or even Ecclesiastes. Okay? But it's believed that Solomon wrote them. So we're going to keep them together because of what? Authorship. Okay? Yeah, Solomon wrote them, so we're going to keep those together. Now, when they looked at them and they read them, they said, you know what, we got to change the order to make them, because they're really not in proper historical order. So they changed them to Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and the Song of Solomon. Now, the other thing you'll notice is because, again, the book doesn't identify Solomon as the writer, as the author, they changed the name from the Song of Songs to the Song of Solomon. There's another reason why they did that, is because one of the books that was also translated and included with the Septuagint was a book called the Songs of Solomon. It's one of the apocryphal books. It wasn't actually written by him. It was a pseudonym that somebody used. And again, so they wanted to separate this and make sure that they understood this is Solomon the king that they're talking about. So now we have created a third genre. So we have history books, we now have some poetry books, and we have some books that are of a prophetic nature, and we group them together. So let's look then at the second group of the writings: Lamentations, Esther, Daniel, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Chronicles. Let's take Lamentations here first. When you look at Lamentations, what genre would you say it is?
Prophetic.
What's that?
Prophetic.
That's the warning.
There's actually no warnings in Lamentations. Okay? Lamentations is all mourning for the loss of Jerusalem and the temple. And if you look at it, the whole book is a poem. So it's all poetry. There isn't one line of narrative in there. It's all poetry. Okay, so that they're looking there and they're thinking, well, what do we do with this? Because we can't really... Who wrote it? That's the next question they asked. Jeremiah wrote it. So obviously when they were deciding what to do with Lamentations, did they decide to go with genre, which is poetry, or did they decide to go with authorship? They went with authorship. And they put it up there with Jeremiah. And they put it after Jeremiah because Jeremiah's prophetic tone is all pre the destruction of the fall of Jerusalem and the temple. But Lamentations is after the destruction of the temple. So Jeremiah covers the end of the southern kingdom of Judah, including the destruction of the city. All right, so that brings us now to the book of Esther. So what do we do with Esther? What would you do with Esther?
It's historic.
Yeah, it's a historic book, isn't it? It's talking about Esther, who's a Jewess, and she becomes the queen of Persia, and you have Mordecai, her uncle, and you have Naaman, and the whole protection of God's people, but they're in the captivity, the land of captivity. So it is definitely historical. So where would we stick it then? If we're going to stick it in the history, it definitely comes after Kings, because Kings ends with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and Esther is after the Babylonian captivity, when the Persians have taken over. So we're going to stick it into history, and we'll stick it at the end there, right? Because we don't know where else to stick it at this moment. So then that brings us to the book of Daniel. Now, Daniel has given scholars all kinds of trouble in trying to figure out what to do with it. Because when you look at Daniel, it definitely seems to be a historic book in that it contains a lot of narratives and stories. So we have Daniel and the other young men who are taken by the Babylonians back to Babylon, and they train them to be servants of the king, and they want to be faithful to the law, so they won't eat the meat. And then God blesses them, and so forth. You have that story. Then you have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Then you have the story of Daniel and the lion's den. Right? So it's definitely narrative. But then in the midst of all this narrative, you have Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the statue, right? And then all of these visions of the beasts and different things, right? So there seems to be a real prophetic aspect of it, but it's prophecy that's totally different than that of Jeremiah and Isaiah and Ezekiel. So they obviously looked at that and they said, you know what, it seems to be more historical in its importance. So we're going to stick it up there, or more prophetic in its importance than being part of the history. So they're going to stick it up there with the prophets. But where does he come? Before Isaiah? After Ezekiel? Daniel wrote during what period of time? During the time in Babylon. Ezekiel also wrote during the time of Babylon. In fact, most people don't realize this, but Ezekiel was taken to Babylon during the second deportation. Daniel was taken in the first deportation to Babylon. So Daniel was in Babylon first, and then Ezekiel came. But Ezekiel was writing before Daniel started writing. Daniel started writing after Ezekiel got there. So we're going to stick him after Ezekiel. So I removed the 12 and put Daniel there. We're going to come back to the 12. Are you following how the thought process goes here in terms of chronology and genre and authorship? So that brings us to Ezra and Nehemiah. Now in the original Hebrew, again, Ezra and Nehemiah were one book. And again, because of scroll length, they divide it into two books. And it's definitely history, isn't it? I mean, it's the remnant that returns. Ezra begins with Cyrus' decree that says, hey, you guys can go back and rebuild your lives in Jerusalem, but you're still going to be under our control. Right? You're just a remnant. You'll never be a nation again, but you could be called the Jews. And this is kind of important when you're reading the Bible. When they're in Egypt, they're called the Hebrews. When they are in their own land, from Joshua to Kings, they're called the Israelites. But when they return after the Babylonian captivity, right through to the time of Christ, they're called the Jews. It's because all this is in relation to them as a people. They weren't Israelites until they were their own nation with their own kings. All right, so Ezra and Nehemiah, does it come before or after Esther? Before. Kind of a difficult question, actually, because in reality, Esther is during the time of the Persians, and both Ezra and Nehemiah are during the time of the Persians. But for simplicity's sake, we can say that Esther comes afterwards. And so we stick Ezra and Nehemiah there chronologically before Esther. All right, that brings us now to Chronicles, the last book in the list. And again, because of the scroll length, we've got to split this book in half and make it First Chronicles and Second Chronicles. Let me give you just a little bit of, it's definitely history, isn't it? In fact, if you talk about a lot of scholars will tell you, or a lot of teachers will tell you, that Chronicles just kind of fits underneath all of the Old Testament from Genesis right through the Second Kings. Well, it's partly right, mostly wrong. Let me explain it to you. Okay, when you look at First Chronicles, the first 9 chapters are all genealogy. And it starts with Adam, so you think, well, maybe it goes back there, but what's it really? It Goes from from Adam, and who does he end with? Do you know? Can you take a guess? Would you say? David, exactly. And that's the whole point here is the writer of Chronicles, the writer of Chronicles is wanting us to focus on David. So he's giving us the genealogy of David. He says, hey, look at, right from the beginning, when God announced to Adam that there would be a seed of the woman that would come and crush the head of the serpent, he says, I want you to know that when we trace that genealogy of Adam, it comes right to David. Right? All the way through. Even when the promise given to Abraham that his seed, his children, somebody in his line is going to bless the nations. And then when Jacob blesses all of his 12 children, he says to Judah, the scepter will always be there. And the king is coming to the line of Judah, which is the line of David. He's showing all of this. And so it's kind of exciting that he's focusing in on David. And then from chapter 9 to 29 of 1 Chronicles, it's all about the reign of David. Sort of begins with Saul. There's one little tiny bit about the death of Saul. That's where it begins. Because David doesn't become king unless who died? The previous king, Saul. So you got to have Saul dying in order to understand that David has now become the king. Okay, that's why he is the king. So it's all about the reign of David as king. When we come into 2 Chronicles, the little bit of a few chapters in the beginning seem to be about Solomon, but the only thing that it talks about Solomon is the fact that Solomon builds the temple. And the writer to Chronicles is very clear that this is not Solomon's temple that he built, but whose temple? David's temple. Because that's right, David is the one who wanted to build God the temple. And God says, that's all right, I really appreciate that you want to build me a temple, but I'm going to let your son build it for me. But it was David's conception and David's idea. So here we have David's genealogy, David's reign, David's temple, and then it goes into the divided kingdom. But you know what? Where 2 Kings, in 1st and 2nd Kings, when it talks about the divided kings, it's mostly the northern kingdom of Israel's kings. And then when it refers to them, they'll say, well, this northern king, he reigned during the time of this southern king. But here's what this northern king did. Okay, and then this southern king died, and the new southern king came along, and then this northern king now, who's during this southern king's reign. But it's really all about the northern kings. 2 Chronicles is all about the southern kings, the kings of Judah. And who are they? It's the dynasty of David. Because what was the promise given? In fact, in 2 Chronicles, we have the promise of the covenant between David and God renewed again, reminding us that David's line of kings will reign eternally. Okay, and they're looking for the eternal son of David who will bring in the everlasting kingdom. And who's that, of course? Jesus, all right? Right? Let's not get hung up in the fact that, hey, this is an eternal promise to a physical kingdom. It is not that at all. It's the kingdom of Jesus that it's talking about. Remember the theme of the Bible again is the kingdom of God and Jesus? Keep that in mind. So, it's definitely history. And the interesting thing about Chronicles is there are 2 verses in the very last chapter that talk about the Babylonian captivity. It's followed by 2 verses that talk about Cyrus's decree. And what does Ezra's book start with? Cyrus's decree. So you see, Chronicles leads right into Ezra in terms of chronology, and it comes after Kings because it's sort of parallel to Kings but includes the period afterwards. So we put 1st and 2nd Chronicles in there. Do you understand that? Isn't that kind of cool?
Yes.
And that's part of the thought process that they were going through. And again, I mean, we really need to understand the chronology of the Bible. And often, when I first gave you the list of the challenge to read the Bible in the year, you remember I gave you several different lists. I said this list over here takes all the books and puts it in chronological order. This one here is the biblical order. This one here, I actually gave you the Hebrew order. and told you can pick whichever one you want. Well, some actually pick the chronological one because that's the way we think. Right now, I'll come back to that in a moment. So where we are now is we're left with the 12. Okay, what do we do with the 12? Now, in the Hebrew Bible, the 12 is one book. And it's really simple. Because you see, their message is exactly the same. In fact, you could parallel the message of Isaiah with the first 6 of the smaller prophets. You can parallel the message of Jeremiah in style and what he says with the next 3. And even the message of Ezekiel parallels to the message of Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. So it's kind of cool when you look at that. Now what I want you to do is I want you to take handout number 8, because I want you to see something. Number 8 is looking at the prophets. So there's every evidence. So the question is, when they took these 12 books, they decided, hey, we're going to separate them because of scroll length. So we don't want to do it into 2 different books, because that might mess things up. So what we'll do is we'll split it with each of the 12. So we've got 1 scroll for each of the 12 prophets, which makes for little tiny scrolls, right? So they have them. So now they're looking at it and they say, okay, the genre is they're all prophets in the same line as Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel. They're definitely that. So now, if you look at that chart there, handout number 8, on the left-hand column, you see it lists them in chronological order. And if we put them in chronological order, Obadiah would be the first. Now that's debated. Some people put Obadiah at the time of the fall of Jerusalem. That's actually a little late. The reason is because he's prophesying against Edom. Okay? So here's the question is, did they take those 12 books and put them in chronological order? No, they didn't. In fact, you'll see that the other 3 columns, you got the English order, the Hebrew order, and LXX is the number 70, and so it's short form for Septuagint. So it's the Septuagint order, or the Greek order if you like. And what you'll notice is of the 12 minor prophets, the last 6 are identical in order, whether it's the English Bible, the Hebrew Bible, or the Septuagint. But the first 6 are the same in the English and Hebrew Bible, but different in the Septuagint. And we're thinking right now in terms of those that put together the Septuagint. So you'll see there that they changed the order. So they got these little books and they're saying, okay, how are we going to put them together? How are we going to organize them? So what do you think they did? They actually, if you look up here on the screen, you'll see they put them in pairs. Okay? Hosea and Amos, Micah and Joel, Obadiah and Jonah. Here's why they put them in pairs. Hosea and Amos, they prophesied against the northern kingdom of Israel. Micah and Joel prophesied against the southern kingdom of Judah. Obadiah and Jonah prophesied against the enemies of Israel and Judah. So Obadiah against Edom and Jonah against Nineveh. So they put them there. So you see that in that column on the right. They've classified the pairs as the prophets to Israel, the prophets to Judah, the prophets to the nation. So they organized them in a logical manner so that they can understand who their message is for. Then, of course, Nahum, Habakkuk, and Zephaniah, they're the prophets between the fall of Israel and the fall of Judah. Okay? And they put Nahum first because he prophesied against Nineveh, so he sort of connects with Jonah, who also prophesied against. Now Jonah, of course, went there and said, hey, God's going to judge you in 40 days. And they all repented, and Jonah was mad, and he sat under the tree. Nahum says, hey, God is going to judge you for destroying Israel. And that's exactly what he did in 609. God destroyed the Assyrians by the Babylonians. Okay. So then Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, well, these were the 3 prophets during the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. So they put them, they grouped them in that way. So, to distinguish, of course, between the group of 12, because again, the Hebrew Bible calls them the 12. That didn't make any sense to the Greek mind. So they looked at it and they said, hey, these are all little books. The first 5 are big books. So we're going to call the first 5 major. We're going to call the 12 minor. It's not in terms of their message or their importance. It's in terms of their size, and their size alone. The first 5 are big. The next 12 are all little. So they were called major and minor prophets. And this is how they were referred to in terms of writings that we have through all the manuscripts. So there we have it. We have all of the history books, which has 2 divisions, the Pentateuch, the normal history, and then the history from being in the land, then being a remnant in the land, so, and then the poetry books, and then the prophetic books divided as major and minor. Now, the interesting thing is that this is how the Septuagint ended up doing it. But our English Bibles, the only difference is the order of the minor prophets. And somewhere along the line, at some point in time, we have no clue how or when or by whom. But the order of the minor prophets was returned to the original order of the Hebrew Bible, and that's how we have it today. And you know what? When we get there, it's actually really exciting when you understand the Hebrew order, why they're in that order that there is. It makes the message of the Bible come out. So the English order is basically a chronological order. It's looking at the history, and that's important because if you remember when we talked about the biblical theology, remember what one of our key words to remember about biblical theology is history. That it is the plan of God in bringing His kingdom through Jesus, but doing it through history, progressively revealed through history. So chronology is really important, and so we need to see the Bible in a chronological order, which is basically what we have in our English Bible. But the thing is, we miss out so much if we don't have the Hebrew order, because that order teaches us about the relationship with God. It focuses on the fact that we are God's people and He is our King. Remember the definition of the kingdom of God? It's God's people in God's place, experiencing God's blessing. Okay? That's ultimately what we're getting to. But God is going after His people, even in our focus this morning on the Lord's table from John 6. Okay, it was talking about God's elected people. Okay, that's what Jesus is after. That's why He came. And the whole kingdom is the theme that holds everything together. Jesus is the center of the whole message. And the structure of the Bible, be it the Hebrew structure or the English structure, really is important to helping us understand the story better. The kingdom is about God's people and how they rebelled against God. They wanted to determine right from wrong themselves, and that created war and conflict on the earth. And they were removed from God's place, from the garden, and one day we will be restored to that perfect garden. It's the story of redemption. God gathering the people for Himself. It's the story of restoring His kingdom to a new earth by redeeming people through the death and resurrection of Christ. So the English orders and the Greek orders, they are always driving us forward to find Jesus. And this is what's been missing for years, is trying to realize that the focus of the Old Testament is not Israel. The focus of the Old Testament is to drive us forward to finding Christ, to waiting for Him to come and to be the final King. So the Bible is a story of redemption. It's about saving the elect from God's wrath through the sacrifice of Christ. And I've already said that several times. It's about giving us a new nature and a new desire to love God and to obey God. So the question today, which is kind of fits with everything that we've been talking about and singing about, is have you placed your faith and trust in Jesus alone for your salvation? Is your hope found in Christ alone? Let's pray. Father, we thank you that even in the simplicity of a study like this, where we kind of sit back and go, hey, we know this. And it kind of makes sense. It's really neat to go through the process. But what it has to teach us, Lord, is that you're a God of organization. You're a God who arranges your word so that it accomplishes what you want it to do. And that is to focus in on Jesus Christ. So that's what we're doing today. We've been focusing on Christ and on His sacrifice. We've been focusing on the fact that He came with a plan to bring about our glorification and give us eternal life. And we're so eternally grateful for it. We long for the day when your kingdom in heaven will be on earth exactly the way it is in heaven. And heaven and earth will be united once again. So, Father, we thank you for your word. We thank you for helping us to learn as we go through this process of these lessons, to understand it better. And we thank you that Jesus Christ alone is our hope. In Jesus' name, amen.
Let's stand one more time.
Sing.